Okay. So we're going to start today on Chapter 9. Chapter 9 has a lot of overlap with Chapter 8, so you're going to see a lot of similar stuff that you saw in the mitosis chapter here in the meiosis chapter. It's focused on sexual reproduction and the process of meiosis, which is the process of making reproductive cells. This will lead us right into Chapter 10, which is genetics. So this is we're really going to talk more about it on Monday, like the consequences of meiosis, but it leads into why we see the genetic patterns we do, so in organisms that sexually reproduce. So really these two chapters go hand in hand. Probably on Monday I'm going to say I don't think that Chapter 9 will take us all of today and Monday, so we'll probably start on some things on Chapter 10 on Monday. And Chapter 10's going to be a big chapter. We're going to go through a lot of different kinds of genetic problems, genetic questions, and so you'll really know a fair amount about genetics by the time we're done that. It's a really fun chapter. We're going to have a lot of in-class problem sets that we're going to work on, and I'll have some handouts and stuff as well to do on that. So most of the next test is going to be on Chapter 10, because there's only kind of a small little bit for this one. Okay, so we went over this at the start of Chapter 8, but again, there's two main kinds of reproduction. There's asexual reproduction, where organisms will copy their genes and split. So binary fission in bacteria through basically mitosis in some eukaryotes, like this amoeba here. You can split into making an identical copy of yourself in your offspring. Sexual reproduction, on the other hand, takes two parents. Two parents will contribute some genetic material that are combined in the offspring, and you can end up with offspring with unique combinations because each parent, this mother cat and the father cat, only gave some genetic information, not all of their genetic information, to the kittens. We end up with here 4 kittens that all have variation, so they all have differences in them. So asexual reproduction, single parent passes on all their genes to their offspring. Sexual reproduction, 2 parents contribute a portion of their genome to their offspring. So we're very human-centric, and we always think that the way that humans do things is the best way to do things. So you probably think, oh, well, sexual reproduction is much better and much more advantage to organisms than asexual reproduction because it's what we do, right? But there are pluses and minuses to both of these modes of reproduction. And this is definitely something you'd talk more about if you took 1011 and you start learning about evolution, you start learning about taxonomy and kind of what's come out of this. But we're going to talk a little bit about it today, the advantages and disadvantages to each. So asexual reproduction, one of the largest advantages to it is that it doesn't require a mate. So there are a number of organisms that can do both, that can sexually reproduce and can asexually reproduce. And you normally find that they asexually reproduce near the edges of their habitat. So there's certain tree species that'll do this. There's lots of protist species that do this. There's some other organisms, even some animal species that will do this as well. If you're near kind of the extremes of where they're found, where there's fewer of them, they're further spread apart, they might asexually reproduce because it's harder to find a mate. So that's one big advantage of it. Another one is that it preserves your genetic traits, preserves desirable genetic traits. So if you are very well adapted to your environment, if you are healthy, you're doing really well, maybe you're a plant and you have the best way of photosynthesizing, you have great defense systems, you are doing excellent in your environment, your offspring will have all of those advantages if you asexually reproduce. If you sexually reproduce, we'll see later, you can dilute out some of those good traits, and we'll see why that on the next slide. So disadvantage to asexual reproduction is that even though it preserves all the desirable genetic traits, it also preserves any undesirable traits. So let's say you have a mutation on one of your chromosomes that leads to a malfunctioning protein. You're going to pass on that mutation to your offspring if you asexually reproduce. There's no way to get rid of that. So if your environment changes and all of a sudden the way you've been operating doesn't work in the new environment, you're out of luck. So you have the traits that you have. So your offspring will have the traits that you have. And kind of along with that, it leads to little variation in offspring. So there's little chance that your offspring will be better than you. There is a chance. Mutations in asexual populations rapidly take on in that population because you will pass on the mutation to your offspring. So if it's an advantageous mutation, boom, your offspring have it immediately. But the chances of that are pretty slim. So there's very little variation in the offspring, except for mutation. So sexual reproduction, the opposite of this, an advantage to sexual reproduction is that it leads to a variety of offspring with unique genetic traits. So where this might be an advantage is in an environment that is changing. So perhaps there's some ecological disaster that's occurring in your environment. If you sexually reproduce, you might have several different offspring, one of which might survive that change. If you were asexually reproducing, if you can't survive, your offspring can't survive. So a sexual reproducing organism has a variety of offspring, some of which might be better at surviving than their parents. However, a disadvantage is that the other extreme is also possible. So some of the offspring are going to be less well adapted than their parents. So it doesn't always preserve desirable traits. Sometimes it can preserve undesirable traits. So look at your siblings. So if you're not an identical twin, then your siblings have different genetic makeup than you. They might have some desirable traits, and they probably have some undesirable traits, whereas you do as well. So maybe your sister is a really good athlete, but maybe you are really smart, right? So you've got two different traits. You don't have the athletic ability. She doesn't have the brains there. Yeah, there you go, if I remember what I say. So you both have different traits. If you all of a sudden are both being chased by a lion, you might die, right? But if you're being chased by a math problem, she's probably going to die, right? So you both have your own advantages, right, and disadvantages. If you were, so let's say you had one parent that had brains and strength, and you had one parent that had neither, what happened was you got one of those traits and not the other one. If your parent had asexually reproduced that had both desirable traits, you would have both. So that's a disadvantage of sexual reproduction, but the advantage is if the other parent had children asexually, you'd have neither of those traits. So you can pass on some traits, but you might also pass on undesirable traits, and sexual reproduction dilutes things. So if you are totally awesome, chances of you having a kid that's as cool as you, pretty low, right? So your kids are probably going to have some undesirable traits of your mate, right? So choose your mate wisely, right? Shoot for someone that's going to give your offspring better opportunities than you. Yeah, there you go. That could be your pickup line. Yeah. Okay, so there are advantages and disadvantages to both. That's kind of the ultimate thing. Okay, so, all right, just to kind of summarize here, here's a pair of amoebas. Here are two kittens. Which two organisms are genetically the most similar? All right. Last few responses. Okay, so most of you are right. 90% of you said A, and you'd be right. The amoebas reproduced asexually, so they are identical genetically. These two kittens are a product of sexual reproduction, so they will share some genetic similarities, but not all of it. So they're going to have, unless they were identical twins, in which case they'd have all the same genes, they will have some unique combination of their parents. Okay, so in order to understand what's going on during sexual reproduction, we need to know a little bit more about chromosomes. So you know that genes are found on chromosomes. Chromosomes are made of DNA, right? Most sexually reproducing organisms have two sets of chromosomes. They get one set from their father and one set from their mother. So you got 23 chromosomes from your father, and you got 23 chromosomes from your mother, so you have 46 chromosomes. Cells that have two copies of each chromosome are what are called diploid cells. Diploid cells have two copies of each chromosome. So.
I just zoned out for a second. Sorry.
All right. No, it's all up here. So you have two copies of each chromosome. One you got from each parent, one copy from each parent. So your cells are called diploid cells. They have two copies. This is what's called a karyotype. It's actually a picture of chromosomes. So here's chromosome 1. One of those came from the father and one of them came from the mother, all the way through chromosome 23, which is here either XY or XX, and we'll talk about what that is on the next slide. Okay, so sexually reproducing organisms have two copies or two sets of each chromosome, and they are called diploid cells. In humans, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes in all of our non-reproductive cells. So here, 23 pairs of chromosomes in what are called somatic cells, which are our non-reproductive cells. 22 of them are what are called autosomes, and one pair of chromosomes are called sex chromosomes. They're called sex chromosomes only because of what lies on one of them. On the Y chromosome, there are a set of genes which, during early development of the embryo, they signal maleness, and they turn on pathways that will lead to someone being a male. So that's the only kind of thing that's different between sex chromosomes and all the rest of the chromosomes is what lies on the Y chromosome. So males have an X and a Y, and females have two X chromosomes. Right? So we'll talk about the consequences of this when we get to the genetics chapter as to the two of them. Really, the only thing that lies on that Y chromosome that's of any importance is the genes that lead to maleness. That's why the Y chromosome is so short, because it doesn't contain any other essential genes. If it did have lots of essential genes, then women would be missing those genes. The only genes really that are on there are sex or maleness genes. Yep.
So autosomes are chromosomes that aren't sex chromosomes?
Yeah, that aren't X and Y. So they're every other chromosome besides the X and Y chromosome. And then the sex chromosomes are the ones that determine gender. So which parent determines the gender of their offspring? Male. Yeah, because if they pass on their Y chromosome, they're going to have a son. If they pass on the X chromosome, they're going to have a daughter. The female always passes on an X because that's all she has, right? So, yeah. So you can. Yeah. So this when Henry, was it Henry V that beheaded all his wives for not having sons? It was not their fault. There was something wrong with his sperm. Right? Okay. So in humans, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. 23, that number, 23 pairs, is not something that is universal. It's universal for humans, but not for other organisms. So here's just to get us away from being so human-centric, which we often are. Barley have 14 chromosomes, 7 pairs. Beavers have, or American beavers have 40 chromosomes. Eurasian beavers have 48 chromosomes. Kangaroos have 16. Yeast have 32. And turkeys have a whopping 82 chromosomes, so 41 pairs of chromosomes. So chromosome number does not relate to intelligence. Otherwise, turkeys would be much, much smarter than we are. Maybe they are for some people, but so chromosome number is just the number of packages that your DNA has been broken up into. So, but the key thing here is that all these sexually reproducing organisms have pairs of chromosomes. So, why pairs, you probably can gather, is because you get half of them from one parent and half from the other parent. But what is the advantage of having paired chromosomes? So having 2 copies of each chromosome. Can you think of any benefit that gives us?
You can.
One fails, does it take it from the other?
Yeah. All right. So you have 2 copies of each gene, so that if you have one that's mutated or non-functioning, you might get a functioning copy from the other parent, right? That's perfect. That's exactly one reason. Well, then you have a non-functioning gene. So that happens as well. We'll talk about that in the next chapter. But yeah, so compensation for defective genes is one, that there are problems that are survivable because you get 2 copies. So there are some times that, and we'll talk about some cases of this in the next chapter, where you have a defective copy of a gene, but a normal copy makes up for it and you don't even notice. If you do have 2 defective copies, then you won't have the function of whatever protein that is. But a lot of times you can survive just fine with only 1 functional copy. Another advantage of pairs of chromosomes is diversity. So we're going to talk about this process of making or determining which chromosome you're going to be passing on, but you don't pass on every single chromosome. You pass on half your chromosomes. So it's going to generate diversity because you might pass on 1 copy to one of your offspring, but you might pass on the other chromosome to the other offsprings that you have. So you can have a variety of offspring. Otherwise, every child you had with the same person would be identical if it wasn't for these paired chromosomes, because whatever genes you pass on would be the same every single time, but they're not. So, and we're going to talk about why as we go through here. Okay, so pairs of chromosomes compensate for defective genes, also can help generate diversity. So let's look a little closer at a pair of genes. So this could be maybe chromosome 1. You have 1 copy of chromosome 1 that you got from your mother. You've got another copy of chromosome 1 that you got from your father. This pair is called a homologous pair. So the word homologous means that it has similar. It means similar. It means that they have a similar, actually shared history. Homologous pairs are chromosomes that carry the same sequence of genes, but perhaps different alleles. Allele, we'll get into what that is more in the next chapter, but that is different versions of the gene. So let's say there's a gene that codes for eye color. You could have the blue eye version of that gene, or you could have the brown eye version of that gene, perhaps. So those are 2 different alleles of the same gene. You're going to get 2 chromosomes, one from your father and one from your mother, each of which has an eye color gene on it, but they might not have the same eye color gene. One, you might have gotten brown-eyed gene from your mother and the blue-eyed gene from your father. We'll talk about in the next chapter how that's reconciled in what your eyes actually look like, so we won't get to that yet. But it is possible that you have 2 different versions of the same gene, and those would be called homologous pairs, those 2 chromosomes that have the same genes on them.
Quick question about that.
Yep.
As far as the eye color, and I'm sure we'll get into it in the next chapter, but usually, or most of the time, aren't babies born almost with blue eye color?
That has to do with how pigment is expressed in the eye. There's 2 locations in your eye where pigment can be housed. People with blue eyes only produce pigment in one of those locations. People with brown eyes produce pigment that goes to a location in front, so it covers up whatever is behind it. So that pigment is produced later, often. So that would be why. That means that they're in one of their eyes producing the brown pigment, and the other one they're not, so you can see the blue. So there's blue behind the brown, right? So we'll get into that more in the next chapter when we start actually looking at genetics. There's a lot of really interesting stuff like that. And that actually, that process, I believe, is more common in females because of what happens with the X chromosome, which is another crazy thing that I don't know if we'll actually get into, but one of them, sometimes they randomly deactivate. And you'll have, because you have 2 copies, and you don't really need 2 copies, you only need 1 to function. So if one of them deactivates, the other one doesn't, it can change some appearances in certain cells and not others. So, so that happens in cats a lot, I think. We'll get that. Yep. We'll get that. What's on your chromosomes? Yes, it does not change throughout your life unless you... Where is it? Through fertilization. So, yeah, which sperm comes together with which egg is going to determine what your chromosomes are. Yeah. We'll get to that in a little bit, but yeah. So, all right. So homologous pairs. Okay, so here's another picture of homologous pairs, and I just randomly put some things on it. There's not actually a chromosome that has these traits on it, but for example, you might have a freckled gene, an eye color gene, and a blood type gene, and you might have gotten freckles, brown eyes, and blood type A from your mother, and no freckles, blue eyes, and blood type O from your father. So this individual would have freckles, brown eyes, and blood type A, and we'll talk about why that is when we get to the genetics chapter. But they have 2 chromosomes with 2 different sets of genes on them that code for the same thing. This is a homologous pair. Okay. So when organisms reproduce, when they sexually reproduce, they're combining their chromosomes with another organism's chromosomes. So does it happen like this? Do you take a cell with 46 chromosomes and combine it with a cell with 46 chromosomes? Why would that not be possible? Okay, you'd have 92. You'd have 4 sets of each chromosomes, and that would not exist. So this is why you can't shake hands with someone and make a baby that way, right? Because your skin cells that have 46 chromosomes and their skin cells can't combine to make a functioning individual, right? Because they have too many chromosomes. So this doesn't happen. So you need to be able to make a cell that has 23 chromosomes so that when it combines with another cell that has 23 chromosomes, it makes an organism with 46 chromosomes, right? So somehow we need to take our 46 chromosome cells and reduce the number of chromosomes to 23. So reduction in chromosome number. That's the goal of this chapter, really, is how do we go about doing that? Unlike some somatic cells, or unlike all of your somatic cells, your gametes, your reproductive cells, contain only a single set of chromosomes. So they are what's called haploid. So this would be a diploid, or 2N cell, and this would be haploid, or N, 1 copy of each chromosome. So it's also key here to note that they didn't randomly take 23 chromosomes from this 46. So I didn't just choose any one. I chose 1 from each homologous pair. So there's 1 chromosome 1, 1 chromosome 2, 1 chromosome 3, all the way through to 1 sex chromosome. So that's really important. You don't want to pass on 2 copies of chromosome 1 and no copies of chromosome 8. You don't want there to be missing genes in your offspring, because they need a full set of instructions for how to make proteins, not just a partial set. So not only do we need to cut the number of chromosomes in half, but we need to make sure that 1 out of each pair gets passed on, and not 2 from one and none from the other. Like which of the 2 in the homologous pairs? Yes, it is random. And we're going to talk about that probably on Monday, exactly how that works, but yes. So yeah, which one of the pair is random, but having 1 chromosome 1 is not random. Yeah, so you need 1 of each chromosome. Okay, so that's important to make this. So what cells do you think in humans are haploid? Yeah, those are the only cells in a human that are haploid, are sperm cells and egg cells. So the only time in your life that you've been haploid is when you were a sperm or an egg cell, right? So prior to fertilization. So sperm and egg cells are created, haploid sperm and egg cells are created, and then they will come together to create another diploid cell to make the offspring. So gametes, like the sperm and egg cells, are haploid. They only have one set of each chromosome, so that when they combine, you will have two sets again. So here's kind of a general life history of a sexually reproducing organism. So this is, again, I realize we're human-centric. We're also very animal-centric. I'm going to tell you about what moths do, which is a little bit differently as we get through here. But so here are two adult frogs. You've got a male and a female. Their cells will undergo a process called meiosis to cut the number of chromosomes in their cells in half in cells called germ cells to make their gametes, the sperm and the egg cells, which are haploid. Sperm and egg cells will come together through a process called fertilization to create a zygote. Zygotes are diploid, single-celled organisms. They have two copies, so they have the genes from the sperm and the genes from the egg have now combined. The zygote is going to go through mitosis to make a juvenile and then ultimately to make an adult organism. So this is exactly what happens in humans as well. Males make sperm, females make eggs through meiosis. Sperm and egg meet up. They form a zygote. The zygote divides through mitosis to make an adult. So in humans, what process is happening more often, you think? Mitosis or meiosis? Right, mitosis. It makes all the cells in your body are made through mitosis. The only cells in your body that are made through meiosis are sperm cells if you're male or egg cells if you're female. Okay, so this is the general, the way the human life cycle would look like, the way a lot of sexually reproducing animals look like. Some other organisms do things very differently, which you'll learn more about if you take 1011. But just to kind of throw one out there, do you think an organism can be haploid and be multicellular? So we aren't, humans aren't, we're only a single cell. But there are organisms that are multicellular and haploid. One of them, which you've probably come across some point in your life, is moss. You guys seen moss before? Yes. Moss. The green part of moss is haploid. It has one set of chromosomes. It does not have two sets of chromosomes. So moss, the green leafy part that you see, is haploid. There will be a haploid, basically male or female version, and there's a haploid male moss version. The male will release gametes. They're not sperm, but they're similar to sperm gametes. They'll swim over to the female. This is why moss only grow in wet environments. They actually do need to swim from male moss to female moss. They'll fertilize the egg that's in the female gamete, the female gametophyte, and it'll produce this little stalk. So if you've ever seen moss with a little brown stalk coming out of the top of it, that brown stalk is the diploid stage of it. So that's diploid, like when we are diploid, right? And then in the top of the stalk, there's a little kind of bulb at the top of the stalk. That's where meiosis occurs, and meiosis produces haploid spores, which will be spread out and will form the green moss again. Right, so the moss that you're seeing is haploid. Pretty cool. Same thing with ferns. Let's see. Now ferns, there is a gametophyte, but it's really, really small. The majority of what you're seeing is diploid, and it kind of changes with that. But there's a lot of seaweeds that are large and multicellular as a haploid thing as well. So ferns do have a multicellular haploid stage. It's just at the very base, very small. So there are other strategies besides this, which is what I'm getting at. But this is the strategy that we use.
So in humans, you're saying two haploids makes a zygote?
Yeah, yeah. So sperm and egg, when they come together, make a zygote, and a zygote is diploid. So it has two copies now. So the only time you have one copy of each chromosome is as a sperm or an egg cell. Okay. So what we're going to talk about the rest of today is the process of meiosis. And you'll have heard a lot of these terms before. There's same stages that are in mitosis are in meiosis. There's just more of them. Meiosis is the process of cutting the number of chromosomes in half. So our example cell here has 4 chromosomes. By the end of meiosis, it's going to have 2 chromosomes in each cell. We're going to ultimately create 4 cells, each of which have 2 chromosomes. Meiosis is going to occur in 2 stages, meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. The big things that are happening in each of them, in meiosis 1, our homologous chromosomes are going to pair up and separate. So we're going to separate homologous chromosomes during meiosis 1. During meiosis 2, we're going to separate sister chromatids. So prior to meiosis, just like prior to mitosis, we went through interphase and went through S phase. During S phase, each of the chromosomes was replicated, and so you have a chromosome here with 2 sister chromatids. So just to remind you that part of it. Okay, so meiosis 1, meiosis 2 creates our haploid cells in the end. Okay, so here are the stages of meiosis 1. Prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase, just like you saw in mitosis, but this time they're prophase 1, metaphase 1, anaphase 1, and telophase 1. It's separated out early and late prophase in your book, but really you can combine the two if you want in your mind. I don't really feel the need to separate them out. So during prophase 1, the chromosomes are going to condense. The spindle fibers, including the centrosomes, are going to appear. The nuclear envelope is going to start disappearing. The difference between mitosis, so prophase in mitosis, and prophase 1 of meiosis is that your homologous chromosomes are going to pair up. So chromosome 1 and chromosome 1 are going to pair up. Chromosome 2 and chromosome 2 are going to pair up. If you're a male, the X and the Y will pair up. Chromosome 23 and 23 will pair up. So all of your homologous chromosomes will line up next to their partner, next to their homologous pair during prophase 1. During metaphase 1, the chromosomes are going to line up on the equator just like they did in metaphase of mitosis, but in this stage, they don't line up like this along the equator of the cell. Instead, they line up with their pair along the equator. So they're going to be lined up in pairs on the equator because the goal of meiosis 1 is to separate the homologous pairs, not to separate the sister chromatids yet. So during anaphase 1, the pairs are going to separate. So one member of each pair is going to go one direction, one member is going to go the other direction. So here, homologous pairs were lined up during metaphase 1. During anaphase 1, the homologous pairs are going to separate and move to opposite poles. Telophase 1 and cytokinesis 1, you now end up with 2 cells, each of which, in this case, has 2 chromosomes. You started with 1 cell that had 4 chromosomes. So here you had a diploid cell. What are these cells? Do they have 2 copies of each chromosome, or do they have 1 copy of each chromosome? They have 1 copy. So 2 copies was diploid, 1 copy is haploid. Yep. So you've already accomplished your goal. You've made a cell with half the number of chromosomes than you started with. So again, prophase 1, nuclear envelope disappears, chromosomes condense, spindle apparatus forms, and homologous chromosomes pair up. There's also a process called crossing over that occurs during prophase 1. We're going to talk about that on Monday. So just to note where that happens, it happens during late prophase 1. Crossing over, we'll see what that does. Metaphase 1, the homologous pairs are going to line up on the metaphase plate. Anaphase 1, homologous chromosomes will separate, move towards opposite ends of the cell. And then telophase 1 and cytokinesis 1, you end up with 2 separate cells, each of which has half the number of chromosomes, so has 1 copy of each chromosome. This is from your book. So it should be the same. Okay. What do you think is going to happen during meiosis 2?
Splitting of the sister.
Yeah. So if you look here, they're still replicated. They're still in this form. So we eventually want to split the sister chromatids. Exactly. So that's what's going to happen in meiosis 2. Meiosis 2 is very similar, but different. Yep, so each of these cells are going to split again, but this time you're not separating homologous chromosomes because you've already split them. You don't have homologous chromosomes anymore. So during metaphase 2, you're going to have your chromosomes line up on the metaphase plate. They're no longer in pairs. Anaphase 2, the chromatids, these sister chromatids, are going to separate and pull apart. And then telophase 2, you're now going to have 4 separate cells, each of which has now a non-replicated chromosome and half the chromosomes that it started with. So you were haploid here. What are you at the end of telophase 2? Yeah, it's still haploid, so it's kind of a trick. Because you didn't add any extra chromosomes, so you wouldn't go back to being diploid. You still have one copy of each chromosome, but it's now non-replicated rather than replicated. So which is most like mitosis? Meiosis 1 or meiosis 2? All right, what's being separated in meiosis 1?
Not the sister chromatids,
The homologous chromosomes, right? And what's being separated in meiosis 2? Sister chromatids. What is separated during mitosis? Sister chromatids, right? So meiosis 2 is most like mitosis. The real difference occurs in meiosis 1 where you're actually cutting the number of chromosomes in half. So here you go from haploid to haploid. In mitosis you go from diploid to diploid. In meiosis 1 you go from diploid to haploid. So you're changing the number of chromosomes in meiosis 1, right?
Why does meiosis differ from mitosis just because it doesn't do meiosis?
Because of meiosis 1. Yeah, meiosis 1 cuts the number of chromosomes in half by separating homologous pairs. So that's the big difference. So it happens in 2 stages. The first stage is the different stage. Stage 2, you're just separating chromatids. So basically, we'll see why these aren't exactly the same at the end, but you're taking this cell and making 2 cells from it with the same number of chromosomes. Meiosis 1, you actually cut the number of chromosomes in half. Okay. Yep. All right. All right, questions on this? So what does meiosis 1 do again? What does it separate? Homologous chromosomes. And meiosis 2? Sister chromatids. Okay, that's the big thing. So meiosis 1 separates homologous chromosomes. And meiosis 2 separates sister chromatids. So you got haploid cells here. You now have 4 haploid cells. These are your sperm or egg cells. When are they going to become diploid again? Yeah, fertilization. So when sperm and egg meet, then they become diploid again. So you've now created sperm and egg cells. This would be in the testes or the ovaries, and they won't become diploid again until they meet up with a partner and fertilization occurs. Okay? So DNA replicated once, nucleus divided twice. First time you separated the homologous chromosomes to cut the number of chromosomes in half. The second time you separated sister chromatids, keeping the number the same here. You end up with 4 cells with half the number of chromosomes that you started with. You started with 4 chromosomes here, you end up with 2. So in humans, you start with 46 chromosomes, you end up with 23 in each of these cells. Okay. Here's a kind of final question that's hopefully pretty straightforward. So let's say the zygote of a ferret contains 40 chromosomes. How many chromosomes would you expect to find? Good, I got another one. How many would you expect to find in a sperm cell? That was real smooth.
Can we get that for you?
If you want. pretty gross down there. All right, there's other ones. All right. All right, last few. All right. So if you chose 20, you'd be correct, which most of you did. Some brave people chose 80. So ferrets, well, you were thinking fertilization. It's the opposite. So zygote is a diploid cell. Sperm cell is a haploid cell. So the sperm is going to have half the number of chromosomes as the zygote, right? So 20 rather than 40. So just remember, we're not always going to be talking about humans. If I said a human sperm cell, you'd say 23, but a turkey has 41 cells in their sperm and egg, whereas they have 82 in every other cell in their body. Okay, so we're going to stop here, and we'll finish up this chapter on Monday and probably start on chapter 10. We're going to talk about genetic diversity. So, all right.